This is Jed Disler, and welcome to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. We are coming toward the end of our mini-series devoted to all 32 Beethoven piano sonatas and 64 pianists, meaning that I am recommending 2 recordings for each sonata and without repeating a pianist. One recording is historic in nature, and one recording is modern in nature. I don't know if the word nature means anything in this context, but you know what I'm talking about if you have been following this mini-series. And before I talk about the piano sonata in A major, number 28, Opus 101, I should tell you that you can subscribe to this podcast through my Substack page, and there's a link in the episode description. And if you take out a paid subscription, you get all kinds of goodies. But please consider subscribing to help us reach out further into the piano community and to keep this podcast in production. The more people who know about this, the merrier. The Sonata number 28 in A major, Opus 101, is a work in 4 movements, although the third movement really serves as an introduction to the finale. Although the sonata that came next after the sonata had the name Hammerklavier attached to it, it's sometimes forgotten that Beethoven also affixed the name Hammerklavier to Opus 101, although it stuck to Opus 106 and not this one. I really love this piece, Opus 101, because it contains all of Beethoven's quintessential qualities. The opening movement expresses Beethoven's tender and lyrical side with unusual eloquence, even for Beethoven, and the subtle contrapuntal layout of the keyboard writing and the care he takes over voice leading has always made me wonder how this music might sound played by a string quartet. I mean, whenever I play this movement on the piano, I can't help but think of the inner voices in terms of the second violin and the viola. And the theme seems to open in mid-sentence because it begins in the dominant key, as if the music had already been in progress before the piece actually began. And I just noticed something looking in my score, that there is only one place in this movement where Beethoven marks fortissimo. So that means that a pianist really has to be careful about judging his or her scaling of the dynamics. I'm always getting on people's cases about getting too loud too soon or never playing softly enough, things like that. By total contrast, the second movement scherzo is a rather quirky march characterized by obsessive dotted rhythms that scurry up and down the keyboard. And this movement, I think, is deeply rooted in what Robert Schumann composed for his middle movement of the C major fantasy. Beethoven here is at his most combative with dissonances in your face and hard-hitting trills, and this is a really difficult movement to play in terms of control and balance and rhythmic precision, and even some of the very best pianists can get flustered by Beethoven's demands. As I said earlier, the slow movement is actually an introduction into the finale, which features a very demanding 4-voice fugue that is no less challenging as the Hammerklavier fugue. Well, maybe it is, but it's certainly not easy to play. I've chosen several recordings that are quite different from one another, yet these pianists share a meticulous approach to reading the score. My historic recommendation comes from a recital for German radio recorded in July 1955, featuring the Hungarian pianist Géza Anda. Now, he made a studio recording of this work a few years later for the EMI label in June of 1958, I believe, and I like that studio recording very much. But I find this earlier radio broadcast even more spontaneous and expressively inflected. I love the ever so slight hesitancies of phrasing in the first movement, because they convey a sense of two people who are just meeting and looking to find common ground. But once that march kicks in, you get the precision of the commercial studio recording with just a little more feeling of abandon here. Geza Anda was always a pianist who zeroed in on little details rather than one who took a step back to take in the big picture. But this 1955 radio performance of Opus 101 lets the big picture in more than Geza Anda usually allows in his interpretations. For my modern recommendation, I turn to a pianist whom I've been privileged to get to know personally, and I also did an extensive interview with him on my radio show Between the Keys about Beethoven's music. I'm talking about Martino Tirimo, who has recorded Beethoven's complete solo piano output. In these recordings, Tirimo tends to favor slow tempos, but he sustains them wonderfully well by virtue of his super scrupulous attention to details in terms of voice leading, note values, dynamics, phrasings, pedaling, yet nothing ever sounds ponderous or pedantic in his hands because the inner rhythm and the cumulative momentum never loosens its grip when Martino Tirimo plays. This is a quality that still makes the best recordings of the conductor Otto Klemperer stand out, where the concentration and integrity of this musician cannot help but compel you to listen. And in this sense, Martino Tirimo is like the Klemperer of the piano, at least in this sonata. His performance is direct, it's deliberate, it's focused beyond belief, and tough as nails. This is Jed Disler, and you've been listening to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. Our next episode in this Beethoven mini-series will discuss the monumental Beethoven Hammerklavier Sonata, the Sonata number 29 in B-flat major, Opus 106. And which recordings will I recommend? I think you are going to be surprised, or maybe you won't be. Anyway, I look forward to being with you next